This council finds it's in a no-win situation because of the housing allocation that's been forced upon us by the government, a vastly unacceptable figure of housing allocation. We have got to continue as a responsible council with the local development process, and we will continue to do that because the risks involved in just saying no, we won't take any further part in the process are quite considerable. It could mean that the government would then force in an inspector and just tell us where we put development without us having any say or input. So it's vital that we do continue the process, but in the meantime we will continue to oppose the vast numbers of housing, and we will campaign with the government and lobby to try and get the figures reduced, which is why it's important that we do hear from the public what their views are, so that will add weight and support to our campaign. Well, without getting into too much detail of numbers, because it is actually all set out on the website, but if we take into account development that's already happened, such as Sharp Hill, which we opposed vigorously and that was granted on appeal, then we are having to find about 10,000 houses adjacent to the urban area of Rushcliffe. If I just make it clear that we have opposed these figures and the allocation that we have been forced upon us, but we are looking potentially at developments in the Gamston and Clifton area, each of which will give about 4,200 houses. The government's regional strategy gave specific guidelines as to where development should take place, i.e. adjacent to the urban area. And so it was identified that these two sites potentially were the only ones that really met the criteria that the government had imposed upon us. Those are areas that have been identified as potential sites, given that we do oppose the development that has been forced upon us. But in order to carry on this process, we must identify some sites, and those are the sites that we've identified as putting out for further consultation whilst we continue to oppose the substantial numbers that have been forced upon us. A general election will happen within the next 6 months, and we know that there's bound to be some change, and we can deal with that as and when that change occurs. But in the meantime, we must continue to lobby ministers to oppose the figures that have been forced upon us, because we don't want to build that amount of development. And we know from the consultation that has taken place already that vast majority of residents tell us that we do not want that amount of development. So we heard what they have said so far, but we want to continue to consult. We want to be sure that we have heard from as many people in Rushcliffe as possible, and so we will continue our consultation process and the development process so far. Absolutely not. We are continuing to oppose the vast allocation that the government's forced upon us, and that is not including any World Cup proposal. So that doesn't bring a stadium any closer at all. These are housing allocations that are being dealt with within the local development framework. This council opposes the vast amount of allocation of housing development that the government has forced upon us. We will continue to campaign against the government to have this number reduced. We will do all we can to continue to protect the green belt, and so that development is not forced upon us in these vast numbers.